January 1943. The endless steppe near Stalingrad frozen to the very heart of the earth. The air temperature had dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. But those were just dry figures on a staff report. Here, on this blindingly white tablecloth sprinkled with ice crystals, the cold was not merely a temperature, it was a living, predatory creature. It penetrated the thick fabric of the flight suit, through skin and muscle, reaching the very bones to gnaw out the last of their warmth. And in the middle of this white hell, beneath a low, leaden sky devoid of even a hint of sympathy, something that barely resembled a man was moving, slowly, with inhuman persistence. This was Oberleutnant Klaus Richter of the Luftwaffe, or rather, what was left of him. His face, once the arrogant and polished face of an ace, a Knight's Cross recipient, had turned into a blue-black mask of frostbitten flesh and dried blood. His lips were cracked and bleeding, reduced to two shapeless strips. His eyes, sunken deep into their sockets, burned with a feverish, insane fire. He was crawling. For a week? 2? Time, here in this frozen desert, had lost all meaning. It had coiled into a tight, endless spiral of pain, hunger, and cold. His legs, both broken in several places during the crash, dragged uselessly behind him, tied to a makeshift sledge fashioned from the wreckage of his own plane. His pride, his deadly spear, the Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. Now, these twisted pieces of duralumin were his prison and his only means of movement. He pushed off the frozen ground with hands wrapped in rags that had long ago turned into blocks of ice. Every inch of progress sent such agony through his body that his consciousness would fade, giving way to a crimson fog. But he crawled, stubbornly, methodically, like a worm burrowing into the snow. He had been a god of war, a master of the skies, one who decided the fates of hundreds of people below with a single press of a trigger. Now, he was nothing. A piece of meat that was still breathing. A shard of desperation that was still clinging to life. In his head, like a broken record, a single thought, a single sound, kept him from dissolving completely into the white silence. The distant, barely perceptible roar of cannon fire to the west. His people were there. Life was there. And he crawled toward that sound, like a moth to a flame, not knowing whether it offered salvation or final annihilation. But to understand how the Falcon became a worm, how the Superman found himself at the very bottom of the food chain, we must go back 14 days, to that frosty January day when his world, so solid and unshakable, plummeted from a height of 3,000 meters. Just 2 weeks ago, the world of Oberleutnant Klaus Richter smelled completely different. It smelled of high-octane gasoline, hot oil, gunpowder, and expensive French cologne. It was a world of buzzing airfields, hastily built officers' clubs where champagne captured in rans flowed like water, and the loud, self-assured laughter of young men who believed in their own immortality. Klaus was the quintessence of this world. A 27-year-old ace with over 200 combat missions to his name and dozens of destroyed tanks, trains, and artillery batteries. His Ju-87 with a predatory shark's mouth painted on its landing gear fairing was known throughout the Eastern Front. The soldiers in the trenches called it the Black Death, and he, deep down, saw himself as a kind of Wagnerian hero, a male Valkyrie delivering righteous vengeance on the wings of his steel steed. His morning began not with a prayer, but with a ritual. A meticulous shave, a snow-white silk scarf around his neck under the coarse fur of his flight jacket. Even here, in the mud and cold of the Russian front, he remained an aristocrat. Then, a walk-around inspection of his plane. He would pat the cold metal of the wing, talking to the machine as if it were a living being. His radio operator and gunner, Unteroffizier Erich Weber, a young freckled boy from Bavaria, looked at his commander with a mixture of adoration and fear. To Erich, Oberleutnant Richter was not just a commander, he was a celestial being, a demigod to whom fear was unknown. "Today we'll show them what the true wrath of the heavens is, Erich," Klaus would say, tightening the straps of his parachute, his voice ringing with cold metal. He didn't hate the Russians. Hatred was too strong, too personal a feeling, To him, they were simply targets, dots on a map that needed to be erased. Convoys of vehicles, fleeing figures of men, flashes of anti-aircraft guns. It was all just part of a great, exciting game in which he was the unrivaled master. In the evenings, in the officer's dugout, he would read Nietzsche while sipping cognac, finding confirmation of his own exceptionalism in the lines about the Superman. For him, war was natural selection, a great purge in which the strongest like himself survive and conquer. He wrote letters to his fiancée in Berlin, full of pathos and confidence in a swift victory. He described the beauty of a dive, the ecstasy of freefall as the earth rushed up to meet him, and the sweet satisfaction when a bomb found its target precisely. He never wrote a word about the fire, the screams, the bodies torn to pieces. That was the other side of war, unworthy of a Superman's attention. On that last day, everything proceeded as usual. The weather report promised clear skies. Reconnaissance had reported a concentration of Soviet troops trying to break through the encirclement ring. The task was simple and clear. Strike, sow chaos, and return to base for a hot dinner. Klaus stood by his plane, inhaling the frosty air. Somewhere to the east, a dull rumble was already audible, a distant artillery preparation. He looked at Eric. "Ready for work, kid?" Eric smiled nervously and nodded. In his eyes, as always, fear mingled with excitement. Klaus smirked to himself. He had long forgotten what fear felt like. He was certain that no bullet, no piece of shrapnel could touch him. Fate was saving him for something great. He climbed into the cockpit, checking the instruments with a practiced motion. The engine roared to life, the propeller spinning into an invisible disc. That day, as he taxied onto the runway, he was, as usual, composing a letter to his wife, unaware that these were the last lines he would ever write with his arms and legs intact, and that the roar he would hear in a few hours would not be the triumphant cry of his Stuka, but the death rattle of tearing metal falling into a frozen abyss. They were flying at an altitude of 3,000 meters, nearly 10,000 feet, a flight of 6 Ju-87s. Below them spread a vast white desert, scarred with the black lines of trenches and dotted with the dark spots of craters. Stalingrad was somewhere on the horizon, shrouded in the smoke of fires, looking like an unhealing wound on the body of the earth. Klaus led his flight confidently, like a surgeon guiding a scalpel to its intended target. The headphones crackled with static and broken phrases. Eric reported the situation. All was quiet. Too quiet. That was the first thing that alerted Klaus. The Russians usually greeted them with a dense wall of anti-aircraft fire. But now, silence. Only the steady drone of the engines and the whistle of the wind in the rigging. "I see the target," the voice of his wingman crackled in his ears. "A column of trucks on the road." Klaus narrowed his eyes. Indeed, below, a line of dark boxes snaked along a snow-covered road. Too easy a target, too obvious. It was a trap. He realized it a second before the sky around them exploded. Dozens of fiery tracers stitched the air, leaving behind dirty black puffs of flak. Anti-aircraft guns camouflaged in the snow had opened up with a hurricane of fire. "We're going into a dive," Klaus commanded, flipping the switch for the siren. "Attack the batteries!" The Jericho trumpet roared, the hellish siren that struck panic into the infantry below. The plane banked and plunged toward the earth almost vertically. The ground rushed up at a furious speed. In his sights, the flashes of gunfire danced. Klaus saw running men, saw the gun crews throwing themselves to the ground in panic. This was his finest hour, a moment of absolute power. He released the bombs and began to pull the machine out of its dive. The G-force pressed him into his seat, and the world went dark for a moment. And in that instant, he felt a terrible, crushing impact in the tail of the aircraft. The machine shuddered so violently that his head slammed against the cockpit canopy. His ears rang. From behind him came Eric's short, choked cry. The plane lost control and fell onto one wing, entering a spin. The cockpit filled with the smell of burning and hydraulic fluid. The control stick went dead, the pedals unresponsive. They were falling, tumbling erratically like a crippled bird. Klaus desperately tried to level the plane, but it was useless. He saw the ground spinning, approaching with terrifying speed. He was screaming something into his laryngophone, calling for Eric, but there was only silence in return. The last thing he remembered was the blinding whiteness of the snow filling his entire vision and a deafening, eardrum-shattering screech of metal. Then, darkness, heavy, viscous, like silt at the bottom of a swamp. He didn't know how long he was unconscious. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. The first thing he felt upon returning to the world was a monstrous cold. He was lying in the snow, thrown from the mangled cockpit. Around him lay the wreckage of his Stuka, black and smoking against the pristine white snow. There was a ringing in his ears. He tried to move and cried out in pain. A sharp, piercing pain, like a red-hot poker, shot through both his legs. He looked down and saw that his legs were twisted at unnatural angles. Bones protruded from his torn flight suit, staining the snow a bright crimson. "Eric," he croaked. There was no answer. Gathering his last strength, he pulled himself up by his hands toward the rear of the cockpit. What he saw there made his stomach clench into an icy knot. Eric was dead. His body was unnaturally contorted, and his eyes, those same eyes that always held fear and excitement, now stared lifelessly at the gray, indifferent sky. Klaus crawled away from the wreckage and vomited. He lay in the snow, alone, helpless, with broken legs, next to the corpse of his comrade, in the middle of a vast, hostile steppe. A lone black raven circled above him, as if anticipating a soon-to-be feast. And in that moment he realized the full horror of his situation. He, the god of war, had been cast down from the heavens. He was alone, and no one was coming to help him. The first few hours after the crash were a fog of shock and pain. Klaus Richter, a man used to making split-second decisions at 500 kilometers, about 310 miles per hour, now lay motionless, listening to every sound. Silence. A deafening, absolute silence, broken only by the whistling wind and the crunch of snow. The battle seemed to have moved far away, leaving him alone with this white infinity. His first reaction was denial. This can't be happening. It's a bad dream. Soon a search plane will arrive. They'll pick him up, and everything will be back to normal. He even tried to spot the dark shape of a rescue Focke-Wulf in the gray sky, but the sky was empty. Then came the pain. Not the sharp pain that had pierced him when he tried to move, but a different kind. A dull, gnawing ache that spread throughout his body, concentrating in his shattered legs. It was like a tide, slowly flooding his consciousness. With the pain came the cold. It crept under his flight suit, chilling his blood. Klaus realized that if he stayed here, he would simply freeze to death. He had to do something. The remnants of military discipline and an innate stubbornness overcame his panic. He began with an inventory. His service pistol, a Luger with a full magazine, present. A flare gun with a few flares, crushed in the crash. An emergency ration, a bar of chocolate, a few hardtack biscuits, and a flask of cognac had miraculously survived in his pocket. A knife, a lighter, a map. That was all. Not much for survival in the Russian steppe in winter. He looked at his legs. The sight was horrific. He realized he couldn't walk. At all. The thought that he, a Luftwaffe ace, had been turned into a helpless cripple was more terrifying than the pain. He tried to push himself up on his elbows, and the world swayed again. Red circles swam before his eyes. He fell back into the snow, breathing heavily. He needed shelter. He needed to build a fire. He surveyed the wreckage of his plane. The fuel tanks were empty, but there might be some oil left in the hydraulic system. He crawled to the wing, fighting off nausea and dizziness, and found what he was looking for. Using his knife, he cut open one of the hoses and collected some of the viscous, smelly liquid in the cap of his flask. Then he broke off small splinters from an ammunition box. His hands wouldn't obey. His fingers were numb with cold. The lighter went out in the wind several times. But finally, after a dozen attempts, he managed to light the oil-soaked rag. A weak, sooty flame flickered to life. It was his first victory. A small, but incredibly important one. He dragged pieces of the plane's skin closer to the fire to shield it from the wind and fashioned a sort of lair for himself. Then he tended to his legs. This was the most dreadful part. He knew that if he didn't set the fractures, gangrene would set in. He cut the trouser legs of his flight suit with his knife. Beneath them was blood and bone fragments. Gritting his teeth until they creaked to keep from screaming, he straightened one leg as best he could, then the other, using pieces of duralumin profiles as splints and straps from his parachute to bind them. The pain was so intense that he lost consciousness several times. When it was over, he lay in his improvised shelter, exhausted, drenched in sweat, trembling from the cold and the horror he had endured. He took out his flask and took a large swig of cognac. The burning liquid ran down his throat, dulling the pain slightly. The first night fell. The sky turned an inky black, and on it, myriads of cold, indifferent stars lit up. The silence deepened. Now it was broken only by the howling of the wind and the distant, barely audible howling of wolves. Klaus lay looking at the stars, and for the first time in a long while he felt not the arrogance of a superman, but a primal, animalistic fear. The fear of loneliness. The fear of death. He realized the search plane wasn't coming. They were shot down over Russian-controlled territory. He had been written off. He was alone with this frozen wasteland. And he had only a few hours left to breathe until his small, pathetic fire went out. It seemed all was lost. But it was then, looking at a twisted piece of the fuselage, that an idea was born in his fevered mind. An idea that was both salvation and madness. The morning of the second day brought no relief, only a new awareness of his desperate situation. The night had been torture. He had to keep the fire going constantly, feeding it with anything that would burn. Pieces of the plane's skin, wire insulation, even pages from the logbook. Sleep was short and fitful, filled with nightmares. He dreamed of the burning cities he had bombed and the faces of people he had never seen, but whose lives he had ended. He woke up to a cold that pierced him to the bone. The fire had almost died. Klaus struggled to add a few more splinters. His body ached, and his injured legs throbbed with a dull, relentless pain. But the idea born in the night gave him no peace. It was audacious, almost impossible, but it was his only chance. He had to build himself a means of transport. He had to crawl west, toward his own lines. He began to inspect the wreckage with a new, feverish energy. He was a pilot. He knew his machine down to the last screw. Now that knowledge, which had once helped him sow death, had to help him preserve life. He found a large, relatively flat piece of the fuselage skin, about 2 meters, roughly 6.5 feet long. This would be the base, the runners. What could he use for runners? His gaze fell on the landing gear skis. They were damaged, but 2 pieces of metal could serve as guides. The most difficult task was to detach them from the struts. He had no tools except his knife and his own hands. He worked for hours, fighting through pain and weakness. He used the knife as a lever, struck the metal with a rock he found under the snow, tore at the fastenings with his teeth. His hands were bloody, his fingers numb with cold, but he stubbornly persisted. Every strike, every screech of metal was a hymn to life for him. This was his first real battle, not in the sky where he was invulnerable, but here, on the ground, where he was weak and helpless. His enemy was not another pilot, but cold, stubborn metal and his own pain. By evening, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the snow in shades of pink and lilac, he succeeded. 2 bent pieces of duralumin lay next to the sheet of fuselage skin. He was utterly exhausted, but a fire of triumph burned in his eyes. He had won. Now he had to assemble the structure. He used everything he could find: wires from the plane's electrical system, parachute straps, the laces from his boots. His improvised sledge looked pathetic and unreliable, but it was his creation, his Noah's Ark in the middle of a frozen ocean. He dragged the remnants of his meager possessions onto the sledge, the emergency ration, the flask, the pistol. Then, gathering his last strength, he pulled himself onto it. This was the most excruciating part. Every movement sent flashes of unbearable pain through his broken legs. He gritted his teeth, bit his lips until they bled, but did not make a sound. Finally, he was lying on his creation, having strapped himself in so he wouldn't fall off. He was ready. Before him stretched the endless snowy plain. To the west, where the sun was setting, the sky was slightly brighter. There, dozens of kilometers away, the war was raging. His comrades were there. He grabbed 2 pieces of tubing that were to serve as his poles for pushing, like ski poles. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the frosty air, and pushed off with all his might. The sledge moved a few centimeters, emitting a mournful screech. Another push, and another. Slowly, agonizingly, meter by meter, he began his journey. A journey that would become his salvation or his grave. He did not yet know that this small victory, this fragile vessel built from the ashes of his former greatness, would be the beginning of his personal hell. A long 14-day journey into the very depths of despair. The journey began. A journey not measured in kilometers, but in heartbeats, flashes of pain, and the number of pushes made. Klaus Richter, the ace, accustomed to covering hundreds of kilometers in an hour, had now become a snail, a tortoise, crawling slowly and inexorably across a vast white sheet. He created a system for himself, as harsh as a military regulation. It was his personal empire, his tiny state on a sledge where he was both ruler and sole subject. The day was divided into cycles, 50 pushes, then a minute of rest. 10 such cycles, a 5-minute halt during which he allowed himself a tiny piece of hardtack and a sip of water, which he obtained by melting snow in his flask cap over a small burner made from a tin can and an oil-soaked rag. At night, sleep. Fitful, shallow, in half-hour snatches, so as not to let the fire die and not to freeze completely. His world became his sledge and the few meters of snow around it. Everything else, the sky, the horizon, the distant sounds of battle, was just scenery. He navigated by the sun. By day, it was his compass, pointing west. At night, he looked for the North Star. When the sky was overcast, he used the wind, which almost always blew from the east, and the sounds of the cannonade, which grew louder and then fainter. He kept track of the days by making notches with his knife on the side of his sledge. Day 3, Day 4, Day 5. They merged into one endless, monotonous nightmare. Snow, pain, cold, hunger. Snow, pain, cold, hunger. His body became one solid knot of suffering. The hands he used to push himself were worn raw, despite his improvised mittens. His broken legs burned with fire. The frost bit at his face. But the most terrifying enemy was not the cold or the pain. The most terrifying enemy was hunger. The emergency ration was designed for 2 days. He stretched it as best he could, eating 1 biscuit and a tiny square of chocolate a day. But on the 6th day, the supplies ran out. Only the flask of cognac remained. Hunger was not just a physical sensation. It was a beast that had taken up residence in his belly and was gnawing at him from the inside. It drove him mad, making him think only of food. Klaus began to have hallucinations. He imagined tables laden with steaming dishes. He thought the snow smelled of freshly baked bread. He tried to chew on his leather belt, gnawed on pieces of his flight suit, but it didn't help. He was growing weaker. His movements became slower and his rest periods longer. Sometimes he would pass out for long stretches, coming to his senses from the biting cold. He knew he was dying. Slowly, painfully. His empire, his strict system, was collapsing under the onslaught of this primal, all-consuming feeling. He looked at his useless legs, at his emaciated body, and a wave of black, helpless rage rose within him. He, Klaus Richter, recipient of the Knight's Cross, was dying of starvation like a common dog in this cursed, snowy desert. His life, so bright, so full of victories and triumphs, was to end so ingloriously. He cursed everything: the war, Hitler, the Russians, the sky that had betrayed him. But even in the darkest moments when despair almost consumed him, he continued to crawl, automatically, instinctively. 50 pushes. Rest. 50 more. His life had fallen into a harsh but predictable rhythm of survival. But he didn't know that the greatest enemy was not outside, but within. In the darkness of his tormented mind, a rebellion was already brewing. The rebellion of his own body against his will. And soon, this rebellion would erupt with terrifying force. On the 8th day of his journey, something happened that finally broke the Superman within him and turned him into an animal, driven by a single instinct: to survive at any cost. Hunger ceased to be just a tormenting sensation. It became a physical pain, a madness that clouded his reason. Klaus could no longer think of anything but food. His hallucinations became more vivid and intrusive. He spoke with his fiancée, argued with the dead Eric, who looked at him reproachfully from the back seat of an imaginary Stuka. He would scream at him, "It's not my fault, Eric. Do you hear me? Not my fault." But the ghost remained silent, and this silence made things even more terrifying. His body began to betray him. His muscles refused to obey. Every movement required unimaginable effort. He crawled, losing consciousness, and would come to without understanding where he was or what was happening to him. And then, in a moment of clarity, he saw it. About 50 meters, roughly 165 feet away, a large black crow sat on the snow. It was pecking at something. Klaus froze, afraid to startle it. A wild, monstrous thought flashed through his fevered mind. Food. That is food. He began to crawl toward it, slowly, centimeter by centimeter. He moved as quietly as he could, trying not to make a sound. The crow, absorbed in its prize, paid him no attention. When he was just a few meters away, he saw what it was pecking at. It was the remains of some small animal, perhaps a hare, torn apart by wolves. Klaus felt a wave of nausea, but immediately suppressed it. He fumbled for a heavy rock he carried on his sledge for various needs. His heart pounded furiously in his chest. He gathered all his remaining strength, held his breath, and threw the rock. The strike was precise. The rock hit the crow in the head. The bird flapped its wings, croaked, and fell onto its side. Klaus let out a triumphant, hoarse cry. He crawled to his prey. The crow was still alive, convulsing, looking at him with one unblinking eye full of horror. Without thinking, he grabbed it by the neck and twisted. Then he sat in the snow, holding the warm, lifeless carcass in his hands. And he did something he could never have imagined, even in his worst nightmare. He plucked the feathers, which the wind immediately caught and scattered across the steppe like black tears. He tore the bird apart with his hands and began to eat. Raw, cold, stringy meat. Blood ran down his chin, mixing with saliva and tears. He ate greedily, bestially, choking and sobbing. It was disgusting. It was humiliating. It was salvation. He, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, an aristocrat of the spirit who read Nietzsche, was eating a raw crow like a savage. In that moment, the last shred of the man he had been died. The god of war was dead. All that remained was a hungry beast that wanted to live. When he was sated, he felt not relief, but a terrible emptiness. He looked at his hands, smeared with blood, and vomited again. But even as he purged the remains of his gruesome meal, he knew he had crossed a line. He had done what had to be done to survive. And he would do it again, if he had to. This monstrous meal, this act of cannibalism against nature, had paradoxically strengthened his will. He was no longer a man burdened by morality and pride. He was simply life, desperately clinging to itself. He had survived, but the cost of that survival was terrible. The days blurred into one continuous gray nightmare. The 10th day, the 11th, the 12th. Klaus lost track of time. The notches on the side of his sledge became his only calendar. He continued to crawl west, having turned into an automaton programmed for a single action, movement. He learned to hunt. He caught mice that scurried beneath the snow, setting primitive snares for them with wire. He learned to find frozen berries and roots under the snow. His body adapted to raw meat and icy water, but his mind began to fail. Loneliness, pain, and constant strain took their toll. Hallucinations became his constant companions. They came not only at night but also during the day, blending with reality until they were indistinguishable. Most often he saw those he had killed. He saw the columns of refugees on the road that he had strafed with his machine guns. Women and children stared at him silently with their empty eye sockets. He saw the faces of Soviet tank crews burning alive in their machines after his precise hits. They didn't scream. They didn't accuse. They just watched. And this silent reproach was more terrifying than any curse. He talked to them. He tried to justify himself. "It was an order," he would scream into the void. "This is war. I am a soldier." But the ghosts didn't answer. Their faces remained impassive. Eric appeared to him especially often, his faithful radio operator and gunner. He would sit on the edge of the sledge, his legs dangling, and look at Klaus with a quiet sadness. "Why didn't you jump, Commander?" he would ask. "You had the chance. You could have saved yourself." "I couldn't abandon the plane," Klaus would reply. "I was trying to level it out." "You couldn't abandon your pride," Eric would say softly. "You thought you were invincible. And look where we are now." These conversations were driving him mad. Klaus would weep, then laugh, then fall into a rage. He was on the verge of complete insanity. His body was at its limit. The frost-bitten parts of his skin had turned black. His legs, despite the improvised splints, had swollen into two shapeless logs. He knew gangrene was setting in. He could smell the sweet, nauseating odor coming from his own limbs. And then, on the 13th day of his journey, when he was on the brink of total physical and moral exhaustion, a miracle happened. As he crawled over another gentle hill, he saw them. A few kilometers ahead, silhouetted against the setting sun, were dark shapes. They were not trees or rocks. They were structures, smoking chimneys, fortifications. It was the front line, German trenches. He had made it. Tears streamed from his eyes and immediately froze on his cheeks in icy tracks. Hope, which had nearly been extinguished, flared up within him with a new, furious strength. He found a reserve of energy he thought was long gone. He began to crawl faster, ignoring the pain that was tearing his body apart. He crawled like a pilgrim to a shrine. He was laughing and crying at the same time. He shouted something incoherent, cheering himself on. Salvation was so close, just a few kilometers. But fate, that cruel and ironic mistress, had prepared one last, most terrible trial for him. He was so engrossed by the sight of the trenches that he didn't notice the movement to his left. By the time he saw them, it was too late. Two figures in white camouflage, on skis with rifles slung over their backs, were rapidly approaching him. A Soviet patrol. They had spotted him. The world narrowed to a single point, to two dark figures gliding across the snow. In that moment, Klaus Richter felt no fear. He felt only an all-consuming, icy rage. To have come all this way, to have survived the crash, the cold, the hunger, the madness, to have crawled dozens of kilometers across this cursed land only to die here, just steps from salvation, at the hands of some faceless patrol? No, he would not give up his life so easily. He, who had been a god of war, would not die like a worm crushed under a boot. He would fight. Slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements, he reached for his holster. His fingers, now wooden, disobedient stumps, struggled with the clasp. He pulled out his Luger. The cold metal burned his palm. He cocked the hammer. The click sounded like a gunshot in the deafening silence. The skiers stopped. They were about 100 meters, around 330 feet away. They had seen his movement. One of them raised his rifle. Klaus propped himself up on his elbows, leaning on his sledge. He was a perfect target. He knew it. But he didn't care. He looked at them through the notch of his sight. The figures in white blurred before his eyes. He waited. Let them get closer. He only had 8 bullets. Each one had to find its mark. Time stretched, turning into a thick, viscous molasses. Seconds felt like an eternity. He could hear the blood pounding in his temples, the wind whistling, the snow creaking under the approaching soldiers' skis. He saw their faces. Young. Surprised. They couldn't understand what kind of strange creature they had encountered in the middle of the steppe. They shouted something in Russian, probably offering him a chance to surrender. Klaus smirked. Surrender? Never. He aimed at the one who was closer. His finger rested on the trigger. This was the end. But it would be his end. He would choose how he died. Not from hunger, not from cold, but in battle with a weapon in his hands. He was just beginning to squeeze the trigger when the silence was shattered by a long, furious burst of gunfire. But it wasn't the Russians firing. The bullets kicked up snow a few meters from the patrol. The skiers immediately dropped to the ground, returning fire toward the German positions. A firefight had begun. A sudden, fierce German counterattack. Klaus couldn't believe his eyes. Dozens of figures in gray greatcoats were running across the snow, firing as they went. Machine guns roared, grenades exploded. He was lying in the middle of a battlefield, caught between 2 fires. Bullets whistled over his head. One of the retreating Soviet soldiers ran right past him, not even glancing in his direction. He had no time for a strange cripple on a sledge. The battle was short and brutal. The Russians were quickly pushed back. And then, when all was quiet, he saw them running toward him. His own. German soldiers. They surrounded him, staring in amazement and horror at what he had become. "A pilot!" one of them rasped. "My God, it's a pilot!" Someone handed him a flask of hot tea. Someone else covered him with their greatcoat. Klaus lay there looking at their faces, unable to utter a single word. He was saved. Euphoria washed over him. He had survived. He had won. They carefully moved him onto a stretcher and began carrying him toward the trenches. He looked up at the gray sky, at the soldiers running beside him, and a feeling of triumph grew in his soul. He had done it. He had returned from hell. But he didn't yet know that salvation was just the beginning of a new circle of suffering, and that the most terrible reckoning awaited him ahead, in the sterile silence of a hospital ward. His journey into hell was over. A journey through the circles of medical hell began. A field hospital, then a hospital in the rear. His story, passed by word of mouth, quickly became a legend. The ace pilot, shot down over enemy territory, who crawled for 2 weeks to his own lines with broken legs. He became a hero, a symbol of the unbending Aryan will. Doctors, nurses, even staff officers came to his bedside to see this miracle. They brought him the order, awarding him the Knight's Cross with oak leaves. His photographs were to appear in the newspapers. He listened to their congratulations, accepted the awards, but felt like an outsider at this celebration. He was there, but his soul was still back in the frozen steppe. He woke up at night from nightmares. He dreamed of the taste of raw crow meat, of the silent faces of the people he had killed, and he would scream in his sleep. During the day, he would lie staring at the ceiling, silent. The doctor said it was combat shock, that it would pass. They didn't understand. They couldn't understand. They saw a hero, but in the mirror, he saw only an emaciated beast. Then came the most important conversation. The chief surgeon entered his room, an elderly, tired man with sad eyes. He spoke for a long time about duty, about courage, about the need to live on. Klaus listened to him, but he didn't hear the words. He looked at his legs hidden under the blanket. He already understood everything. "Gangrene," the surgeon finally said. "We did everything we could. But to save your life, we have to." He didn't finish. Klaus nodded. He felt neither fear nor despair, only a dull, all-consuming emptiness. The operation was a success. He survived. When he woke up from the anesthesia, he didn't dare look down at first, but then he forced himself. Under the blanket there was nothing. His legs, which had carried him across the earth, which had pressed the pedals of his Stuka, which he had so painfully saved in the steppe, were gone. They had been amputated almost to the knees. In that moment, he knew that the part of him that was Klaus Richter, the ace, the god of war, was dead. It had not died in the crash, nor in the frozen steppe. It had died here, on this operating table, under the bright lights of the surgical lamps. The one who survived was someone else, a stranger, a cripple, a man with no future. The legend about him continued to live its own life. The newspapers wrote about his feat. He became a role model, but he himself withdrew deeper and deeper into himself. He refused food, wouldn't speak to the staff. He just lay there, staring at a single point. He had won the battle against nature, but he was losing the battle against himself. His salvation had turned into a new, even more terrible prison. The prison of his own body and his own memories. He had conquered the steppe, but the steppe had taken up residence inside him forever. After several months in hospitals, he was medically discharged and sent home. He returned to Berlin not as a triumphant hero, but as a quiet, broken man in a wheelchair. The war was still going on, but for him, it was over. He lived with his fiancée, who, despite everything, had stayed with him. But their life together turned into a quiet, painful coexistence of two strangers. He couldn't tell her what he had been through. How could one explain the taste of raw meat or the silent reproach in the eyes of the dead? And she couldn't understand his detachment, his nightly screams, his empty eyes. The chasm between them grew wider every day. His awards, his fame, it all seemed like a mockery to him. He was a hero on posters, but in reality he was a helpless cripple, completely dependent on others. Sometimes journalists would visit and he would obediently tell them a sanitized, censored version of his story, about courage, duty, and love for the fatherland. But he never spoke about the essential truth, about how a man turns into a beast, that at the very bottom of despair, there's no nation, no ideology, only the primal will to live. The war ended. Germany lay in ruins. Peace came, but this peace was alien to him. He felt neither joy nor relief. He had survived Stalingrad, but Stalingrad would not let him go. He lived quietly in his small apartment, received a disability pension, and read books. Sometimes, watching children play in the courtyard, he tried to imagine what his life would have been like if that shell had missed. But these thoughts only brought pain. He died in 1972 from a heart attack, quietly, unnoticed, in his bed. The obituary in the local newspaper had a few lines about a war veteran, a recipient of the Knight's Cross. No one remembered his incredible story of survival anymore. It was too inconvenient, too terrible a truth about a war that everyone wanted to forget. He was buried in a small-town cemetery. The grave was quickly overgrown with grass. It seemed the story of Oberleutnant Klaus Richter was over for good, lost to oblivion along with millions of other nameless tragedies of that terrible war. But stories like this do not die. They go underground, transforming from facts into legends. The official Luftwaffe archives recorded only the dry data. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, Jew 87, shot down in grid square so-and-so, considered missing in action. Later, an amendment was added about his miraculous rescue and medical discharge. But in those papers, there was not a single word about the 14 days of hell. About the sledge made of wreckage, the raw crow, the ghosts that haunted him in the snowy desert. This truth was too brutal, too de-heroizing. It did not fit into the grand chronicle of the war, but the story did not disappear. It lived on where all true legends are born, in soldiers' dugouts and hospital wards. It was told in whispers, passed from one person to another. Among the veterans of the Eastern Front, there was a tale of the crawling Stuka, a pilot who was shot down but refused to die and crawled back to his own lines from the very heart of enemy territory. Over time, the story acquired new, fantastical details. It was said that he survived on wolf meat, that a ghostly white dog guided him across the steppe. It was said that he killed 3 Russian soldiers with his bare hands before he was rescued. The story became a myth, a parable about the indomitable will to live, which is stronger than death, cold, and despair. Klaus Richter, the real man, was forgotten, but his legend lived on, becoming part of the vast, unwritten epic of the Second World War. This story is not just a chronicle of one man's survival. It is a reminder that war rips away all masks, exposing the very essence of human nature. It shows that the line between a hero and a beast, between a god and a worm, is just a single step. And sometimes, to survive, you must take that step. You will not find the name Klaus Richter in the history books. But as long as we tell such stories, we remember the true cost of war. The cost paid not by states and armies, but by ordinary people, thrown into the epicenter of a catastrophe and forced to fight their own small private war for the right to take one more breath. Write in the comments what you think about this story, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other forgotten pages of history.